The last country in the world to be explored and settled by Europeans was Australia. It's less than 2 centuries since their first tentative settlement on its continental vastness. There were no conquistadors to beat this harsh red land, no zealous missionaries or military expeditions. Rather, the figure that opened up Australia was a lone man on horseback, a solitary rider, sometimes called a drover, more commonly, the stockman. The time is 2 in the morning. The temperature is about 1 degree. It's so cold because we're far inland. However, when the sun rises in about 4 hours, the day will be hot and very dry. This is the town of Winton in central West Queensland, and 40 riders have assembled in the main street for the start of an epic horse race. Only they don't like to call it a race. Rather, it's a ride, an endurance ride. The longest endurance horse ride in the world. The distance, 250 kilometers, or to use the measurement they still prefer in this area, 150 miles. A marathon ride across country so boundless, it's known simply as the Outback. And the purpose? To recall for a modern generation the toughness of people who first challenged this country, and with little else than toughness on their side, won. This is Western Queensland, an area that's so big it's almost impossible to get its size into perspective. But there are landowners out here who can jump in a vehicle when the sun comes up in the morning, keep driving until the sun goes down at night and be flat out reaching the other side of their property. And that's how big it is. And yet the nearest big city is perhaps 1,000 kilometers away. And it's quite extraordinary to think of the effect that this great area of land, this dusty wilderness, and the people who live in it have had upon the development and the forming of the character of the continent of Australia.
You want to work up?
Yeah, work up.
Push gate. All right, cut your horses now.
"80 years ago, Australia was still a group of separate colonies. She was about to federate into a commonwealth and was flushed with enthusiasm for her new national identity. But what was the Australian image? Who were Australians? Writers and artists of the time tried to find an answer, but it wasn't easy. They could find little that was distinctively Australian in the cities. So they turned to the bush, and they found their folk heroes. Here they discovered an image Australia could show to the world as being uniquely her own. The outback Australian was seen as tall, lean, suntanned, self-reliant, yet comradely, tough, yet sentimental. To the suburbanite, who might rarely see the bush, there was pride in belonging to the land of the kangaroo and the bushman. Here was something Australia could show to the world, a new sense of brotherhood and equality. Perhaps we can scoff at such thinking today, but the raw nationalism those writers inspired from the bush image did much to bring the colonies together, to form the Australian nation of 1901. Droving is a very Australian word. It's the term for moving sheep or cattle on foot, often over very long distances. first explorers penetrated the Australian hinterland, people seeking grazing land followed on their heels. Space was plentiful and they pushed their herds on, despite the danger of scarcity of water or forage, of Aboriginal attack, food and poisonous bloods. The properties those pioneers selected for themselves were often massive. Victoria River Downs Station, for example, was as big as Belgium. The Costello Durack holding on Cooper Creek covered 17,000 square miles. The homesteads were sometimes splendid, but they weren't stately homes. Everything's too big and spread out. Today they use aeroplanes as casually as the city dweller uses his car. As the settlers moved into remote areas, they had the problem of getting their stock back to the mountains. The answer was to develop pioneer stock routes, and a remarkable system became established across the outback. Some, like the Canning stock route, were up to 1,500 kilometers long, endless trails that pushed through the heart of the driest continent on Earth. The Birdsville Track crosses some of the most arid country in Australia, where temperatures reach 45 degrees Celsius, that's 110 degrees Fahrenheit. It seldom rains along its course, and when it does, it floods. Life on the road meant two extremes for the stockman: excitement and danger, or utter monotony. There was nothing much in between except for feed and water worries. Usually he spent 18 hours a day in the saddle and would often go watch over the herd at night as well. His pay was around $2 a week, paid at the end of the trip. And his diet, year in, year out, would almost certainly be meat and damper.
It's all ready to go in the coals now.
The damper, basically it's unleavened bread made of flour and water and baked in the ashes of a campfire. A good damper is the mark of a true bushman. Hugh Sorey is one of Australia's most successful painters. He's also a great lover of the traditions of the Australian bush, which isn't surprising. He grew up on the banks of the Condamine River, which has been immortalized in bush ballads. He remembers how his mother carried water in kerosene tins, and how with the proceeds of his first art sale he bought her a pair of blankets. Up till then she'd made do with chaff bags, interlaid with newspapers. Among the many jobs Hugh Sorey tackled in the bush was a spell as a head stockman. Now he wants erected to their memory a hall of fame.
Well, I think he was the backbone of this country, the backbone of the nation, I think. And, I mean, the whole business revolved early in the piece on cattle and sheep and what they could do with the country. And it was the stockman who was just the plain backbone of the whole country. And I think it's about time that we realised the fact and did something about it. So hence the Hall of Fame. Well, there it is there. So that's the real Australian damper. It's good. Want a piece?
You eat it, mate.
R.M. Williams is 72 years of age. He started as a barefoot camel boy leading exploration teams through Central Australia. Later he made his fortune in business, but never lost his feel for the outback and the men who made it. He joined Hugh Sorey, and together they floated the idea of the memorial to the stockman. To gain publicity for the project, they planned the endurance ride. That's why 40 of the nation's top riders are in this dusty, remote part of Australia to take part in the longest endurance horse ride in the world. out there will tell you this is the finest cattle country in the world. And they're probably right. At times like this, it looks magnificent. This immense sweep of central West Queensland. Magnificent, but stupefying in the scale of its space and emptiness. And incredibly harsh at times, too. Only in the last decade, there was a drought here that dragged on for 6 years. Little wonder it takes a certain type of person to tackle country like this. The stockman was such a person. Why is it we hear so much about the American cowboy and so little about the Australian stockman? Well, probably because the Australian stockman didn't have the glamour of the gunfighter. The battles that they had to fight out here were battles with kangaroos and rabbits that destroyed their pastures, and fire and drought and loneliness. So the men who fought these enemies in this sort of country were simply known as the battlers.
If it's unfortunate that one of your horses break down, my horse float has been towed through by the Maxwell boys from Winton in a Toyota, and it's coming right along the tail of the field. It's picking up all the signs as we go. If your horse breaks down and you can't continue, stop on the track. If we get more than two, we'll have to work out what to do, but two for a start. I hope there's none.
As the lineup for the endurance ride shows, the battler spirit is still strong out here. Among the men and women entrants are some of the best riders in the country. Jackaroos, rough riders, property owners' wives. International show riders, assorted bushies of one kind or another, and those who just love horses. And there are people who have spent their lives in the saddle, stockmen like Kelly Smith. Has it improved in the 27 years you've been doing?
Well, I guess it has, because, you know, when I first started, very few got over, say, 1,000 or 1,200 head of cattle. But I've had up to 2,500.
In one mob?
In one mob, yeah. I had one mob this year, 2,200. And so what I mean, it must have improved quite a bit, all the cattle in here, you know.
How many hours a day would you spend in the saddle?
Oh, well, it's 24 hours a day, and I think about 25.
You sit in the bloody horse 25, you reckon?
I think so. That's why there's riding every working, isn't it?
R.M. Williams, please.
The horses are as tough as their riders and as varied. There are station horses and pure Arabs, quarter horses, thoroughbreds, stock horses, and just plain bitzers. Before they face the starter, they must pass veterinary checks. Any sign of physical abnormality and the horse is out. Similar tests will be carried out at points along the route. They're strict, and they'll break more than a few riders' hearts before the ride is over.
Got to be something wrong with that horse, Mr. Mackham, surely. Like hell. Hey, the rider.
This is Winton, the type of town those early battlers left behind, and starting point for the endurance ride. Winton is remote, but it's made its mark on Australia too. It claims early association with Qantas, for example, now the world's 8th largest airline, which started around here. They'll tell you Lyndon B. Johnson spent a night here once. Not when he was American president, but as a member of a bomber crew that passed through during the war. But the most important event that ever happened at Winton was the writing of a song. It was the work of a man called Banjo Patterson. Winton's tough. If it wasn't, drought would have killed it off years ago. To the west of here, the countryside slowly degenerates into desert and stays that way until it hits the Indian Ocean 3,500 kilometers away. It's a cattle town, and everything has a strong but conservative he-man flavor. This is seen in the touch of rural coyness about the labeling of the one public toilet in the main street. And when it comes to celebrating, the pubs are wide open and masculine. And so's the attitude to overindulgence. Winton was established by battlers, and the struggle isn't over yet and never will be. Country like this never gives up. Down at the Winton Showground, they've made their last surveys of the track. They've had their last practice gallops. For out-of-towners, it's been a matter of getting their horses used to the temperature. Some of the entrants come 2,000 kilometres from as far south as Victoria. A couple of extra degrees can make a considerable difference to the performance of a horse when you're pushing it for 250 kilometres. It's time for a final think about tactics too. Different breeds of horses will need to be handled in different ways. Some are used to galloping in hilly country, others have been bred for short bursts of speed. Some are night horses and so on. On many of the stations out here in central and western Queensland, horses don't need to be shod at all. The country's soft enough for them to work in bare feet. This is entirely an Australian idea, although it's not the practice all over the country. A horse is at its natural best with bare feet, and shoes are an encumbrance. But to ride a horse without shoes over hard ground is unpleasant enough for the rider and real torture for the horse. And in the early stages of the coming ride, there'll be a lot of hard ground. One stretch in particular has the experts worried.
Further out, there's a lot of rocks, a lot of stone, about as rough as it can get. Too rough for a car. Yeah, very rough. So we think we might walk them over that piece. We'll get our mileage on the flat. A lot of good mileage, and there's only a small piece of bad mileage, you know. But it's almost as rough as a horse could clamber over.
This is the old road from Winton to Longreach, part of the toughest stretch of the ride. Most of it will be covered in darkness. It was a cattle trail once, and Cobb & Co. coaches rattled over here as well. Cobb & Co., the coach line formed by 4 Americans to service the Victorian goldfields. It spread through the country to become the biggest transport company in the world at that time. How its coaches negotiated stretches of track like this with a full load of passengers remains a source of wonder. Even experienced horseback riders are going to need to take it easy along here.
Be a geologist's paradise, I think, eh? Some pretty sharp fellas. I could be in for a few problems here with some of the horses. They might bump their fetlocks a fair bit here. I think it could be an idea to use a skid boots on muscles, and might help him over this section. The worst of it, anyway.
Scott Champion is 16 and the youngest starter in the ride. His father Warwick runs quarter horses at Longreach. You'd think you couldn't get a better combination than that. Local knowledge and a lifetime among horses. But the night ahead is going to challenge the lot. It's little wonder that when the early pioneers saw this land, it intoxicated them. These great tracts of free land, land that was unencumbered by previous owners or commitments, land that rolled on to the horizon. They simply pushed out as far as they could and settled. They bought or stole a few cattle from nearby properties and began to build up their herds. That was the birth of an industry and a whole breed of people to sustain it.
6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
40 riders hit the trail on the 2 a.m. start. The pace to begin with is restrained. In fact, few horses will hit top speed during the race. The pace that wins will be steady and enduring. Even so, a number will be eliminated even before the sun's up. It's going to be a long, hard ride.
Get out of it, Durley. Get out of it. Walk up.
Men who work among cattle find out some interesting things as the years go by. Do you know, for example, that bullocks have mates? At the start of a big cattle drive, stockmen notice that after a day or two, the animals start to pair up, and they stay that way until the end of the journey. This can make work much harder when it comes to yarding the stock and breaking up the herd. The newfound cattle friends don't like to be separated, and the bigger the mob, the bigger the fuss.
Lock up.
Historians have traced a similar mateship streak among stockmen that developed into a tradition. If one fell out with the boss and got sacked, his mate would probably leave too. Around the turn of the century, this sense of mateship, of independent men who stuck together in the face of trouble, was recognized as part of the philosophy of bush society. It was looked on as a worthy characteristic Australia could show to the world. It was part of that Australian image our fathers so desired. Supposedly, it was one of the early expressions that launched the trade union movement, and it had its birth here in the dust of the long cattle drives. The stockman drover stood larger than life in Australian outback folklore. It was full of stories about his epic, even heroic droving feats. His profession exposed him to varying degrees of privation and hardship and long periods of separation from his family. Tonight in this endurance ride, the competitors are getting a taste of that toughness expected of them.
Turn to the right.
There you. How's the tea? You got it?
The night is cold. There's no moon. The track's difficult to find. And the first checkpoint is a long, hard ride away yet. A number of riders won't find it.
How are we going? All right?
Good, yeah.
In the days gone by, stockmen chased stampeding herds through nights darker and colder than this, and considered it all part of the job.
You can talk of your whiskey or talk of your beer. There's something much nicer that's waiting me here. It stands on the fire beneath the gum tree. There's nothing much nicer than a billy tea.
But it seems that all our pioneers weren't lily white. There's the story of a fellow called Harry Redford, who was around in these parts about 1870. And Harry was a pretty famous cattle duffer, or rustler, or thief, whatever you like to call it. And he decided some other fellow had 1,000 head of cattle that he needed more, so Harry took them. And he drove them from Longreach to Adelaide, which is a distance of some 2,500 kilometres. And that was 1870. 10 years earlier, that same country had taken the lives of Burke and Wills. Anyway, Harry Redford got away with it for about 3 years, sold the stock and managed to avoid the law. But finally they caught up with him, brought him back, put him on trial. And the day of the trial was really Harry's lucky day, because it turned out that the jury was made up totally of stockmen who considered Harry to be some kind of celebrity, so they let him off. It wasn't men alone who beat the outback. Despite the Australian male's reputation for being something of a chauvinist, the pioneer man was only too glad to have a woman alongside, if he could find one, and to bring up families to share the hardships of isolation. Henry Lawson wrote of the drover's wife and the loneliness when the husband was on the track, and the children who promise they'll never go a-droving. Family rearing still has its problems out here. Some of these children travel 150 kilometres a day just to get to school. When it comes to endurance horse riding, men and women are equals. In fact, horsemen have a healthy respect for the way in which women can often get far more out of a horse, their patience with the animal and their understanding of it. Carolyn Davidson breeds quarter horses, and she's entered 2 in this ride. For months before the start, she began a regular pattern of exercising to toughen them up.
Well, these 2 have been in training for 3.5 months since the beginning of April. We put them both in feed. For the first couple of weeks, we do about 10 miles of trotting and some cantering. We've built it up to 50 miles a day with the occasional 50 or 60 miles ride about it twice every week. And then the other 3 days of the week, they only do about 5 to 10 miles.
The early morning dip is part of the program. Obviously, it's not the horse's favourite relaxation. It's cold on this property in the morning, halfway between Winton and Longreach, but that's all part of the treatment.
It's very good for their wind. It builds their wind up, and it's just like a short gallop. It's got the same effect that galloping a racehorse has got, and it stops the legs getting sore. Take him round. It's out in the middle over there.
It's 2.5 hours since they left Winton. In the endurance ride, it's time to light up at the long-hoped-for first checkpoint, the only stop for the riders until well after sunup.
Wave him in, show him the way. Horse number 37 and 38. Come in together.
The first riders chilled to the bone after 2.5 hours in the saddle.
Horse number 9. Number 12.
A small group have a handy lead already, and they're in a good position as they face a mandatory 1-hour break.
There, right?
As soon as they come lathering in, each horse and rider must undergo a series of checks. Weight is the main concern for the riders. Their average combined saddle and body weight is 210 pounds.
I'm over here. I'm over here with me. 15.5. 15.5?
Oh, God.
For the horses, there are 2 stiff sessions at the hands of the vets. Immediately they're unsaddled, their pulse and respiration rates are checked. Half an hour later, they'll be checked again. Within that time, each must have dropped substantially to a predetermined level. If the vets aren't satisfied about this or any other aspect of the horse's condition, it's out.
38's time out, 4:53.
Number 27 just going past now. Block him on the fence, boy.
Okay, over and out.
Even at this early stage, it's clear that a few riders are in trouble. The field's well scattered, and there's little doubt several, including some of the top identities, are overdue.
19, Red. 19, 22 and 21.
R.M. Williams is there, but not Hugh Sorey. The man who was one of the driving forces behind the ride has missed the checkpoint in the dark. He won't be the only one to come to grief, although the full story won't be known for hours yet. Young Scott Champion is missing too. RM seems to be well satisfied, keeping to the steady rate he'd planned. This is where 60 years of experience in the saddle will tell. 60 years, carving a living on horseback out of a country that's often brutal and never easy to settle. In the meantime, weariness has touched a few already. Maybe it's the result of the rough patch gone by or the thought of the ride ahead. 160 kilometers, 100 miles of stony track, followed by dry plains that sweep to the horizon. That's the prospect next in this longest endurance ride in the world. In central western Queensland. This is called Top Rock Country, and it's halfway between the first and second checkpoints in the endurance ride. It's the time when the temperature drops to its lowest, despite the pink hints of a warm day to come.
How far?
The first riders are well into the stony ground, and they're taking it easy in the poor light. To push hard on these rocks could mean a thrown shoe or a damaged fetlock. Certainty is to put a horse out. There's also difficulty in finding the way. The track splits up in many places into dead ends, blind trails that finish in bush or creek beds. Riders are bunched up to help navigate through the brush.
come on, it's not smoker time. Ring.
As they push through this stretch, the riders hear stories of the fate of others during the night, of search parties setting out to look for the stragglers. But still, the call is to push on and keep a steady pace. For others, the ride is definitely over. For this year, at least. Sandy Bolton is a stockman on Manaroo Station, the one major resting place on the ride. However, Sandy won't be cantering home in triumph this year. The story's typical. His stock horse has gone lame, and he won't push her anymore.
Yeah, she's gone a bit lame. We missed the first checkpoint.
Oh, you missed the checkpoint as well.
Checkpoint, yeah.
What happens when she goes lame?
Well, she's gone lame in the shoulder. It's a problem we've been having for a while, but sort of, I suppose it's a chance you've got to take, you know. They might be all right or might not be.
So it wouldn't be safe to ride her now in this condition?
Oh, well, I'll certainly have to ride her on, but I won't be, you know, racing, I'll put it that way.
This 52-wheeled monster is called a road train, and for the past quarter century, its rumbling diesel bellow has marked the decline of the stockman drover. Beef roads, which now cross most of Australia, new abattoirs in beef-growing areas, and the introduction of refrigeration have reduced the need to drove cattle on the hoof. The decline of the stock routes was fairly abrupt in the 1960s and 70s, and overlanding is now at a low ebb. However, you can still encounter mobs of cattle on the move in every state, and the historic old stock routes are still being maintained. They're fairly inconspicuous in the landscape, marked only by the occasional windmill, trough, or signpost. Thousands of kilometres are kept in order with watering points, fencing, camping reserves, inspectors, administrators, and the stockmen say mountains of paperwork to mark their existence. And there are still plenty of stories being told to keep up the legend of the great riders who used trails like these. You know, it wasn't so many years ago that the mailmen used to come out here on horseback and deliver mail to all these places. And as you can see, it's pretty rough country. One fellow called Jim McDowell used to take 6 pack horses, ride 190 miles in 6 days, camp for a day, then turn around and do it all over again. Jim McDowell did that for 15 years. And one day back in 1951, one of the pack horses came home. No Jim. They went out looking for him and found him dead by the side of the track. The leading riders have reached the flat downs that sprawl blankly for hundreds of kilometres, and the pressure is on. This is where they can make up time before the heat slows everybody down. Different horses prefer different gaits. The object is to cover as much ground using as little energy as possible. For some, it's the canter. For others, the non-stop trot. The trot is easiest on the horse, but hell on the rider. At the tail end of the field, the stragglers are still coming out of the hills, tired and knocked up. And they'll tell of their distress in the sun-drenched accents of far west Queensland.
How are you? Got any water? Are we allowed to get a drink of water off you? I'm perishing.
The riders hear stories of others during the night, of riders separated from their horses, of search parties setting out to look for the stragglers, of riders who became lost and missed the checkpoint.
You missed it. How did you miss it, though?
Thing was, we were still following Harris.
Oh.
At the checkpoints further out on the downs, the horse floats are rumbling in. The horse float, sign of another horse that can't make it. The riders are well scattered now, and there's a lot of waiting to be done between arrivals. A checkpoint has been placed each 50 kilometres or so, and apart from supervising the progress of the ride, its role is to see the horses aren't ridden to death.
Number 18, 2 minutes, a vet check.
The vets are busy and thorough. Dehydration is one killer that they watch for. A horse is fit to race when it can cover 45 kilometres in 3 hours with ease and without what they call white sweating. This indicates the horse is losing vital body salts and too much water. The experts say that if a horse keeps sweating, it's got the wrong metabolism for an endurance racer. There are other signs of distress they look for too. And at this stage of the ride, they're finding them more and more frequently.
Give him about an hour before you move, will you?
This horse has come to a standstill, and it's the end of the trail. He's developed a tremble, which is sufficient to cast doubts on his ability to continue. The vet orders him out, and that means another call for a horse float to take him home.
The best thing, I suppose, really. It's no good. No good killing him for nothing. Oh, quite happy you even got to start. Matter of fact.
Many of the competitors are now riding by themselves. Some won't see another rider. In fact, they won't see anyone until sunset or later. Horse and rider will fight this toughest stage alone, as they've been doing it out here for a century and more. At the turn of the century, there were 1 million horses in Australia. At the same time, there were only some 2 million people, so there was a horse for every 2 humans. The horse was big business, and some of the stations here in Queensland ran 10,000 of them. There were horse drives too, like cattle drives, when huge mobs of the animals were driven long distances around the country. Since then, the horse has been in decline. And in recent years, many stockmen have been more at home in the saddle of a Yamaha. But the energy crisis, among other things, has made property owners look to the horse again. And breeds like these quarter horses from Texas have added new blood.
What's I can't follow that?
This new interest in the horse also led to the revival of an almost forgotten sport, endurance horse racing. And that meant the training of horses again for the kind of effort that was once a part of life. Endurance. That's the key word. The ability to keep going when the track never ends and the temperature climbs and the enormous world around you is wrapped in heat haze. These riders have covered about 150 kilometres so far today. They face another 50 before the first break of any consequence at Manaroo Station. Another 50 parched kilometres to go through the hottest part of the day. This is endurance riding. The endurance to keep going as the pace drops from a canter to a trot to a walk, and sometimes to a stagger. When it becomes too much for the horse, you get off and walk. Like a sailor in a small boat, the riders push on for a horizon that keeps receding. The horses have to be superbly conditioned for an event like this, and so do the riders. A tired rider increases the burden his mount has to carry, and riderless horses don't win races. The rider tries to relieve the weight from the horse's back by carrying it through his own legs, and you need thighs of iron to take that mile after mile. To use an expression of R.M. Williams, you also need a backside as tough as a black tracker's feet. Carolyn Davidson's quarter horse is in trouble. It's developed a limp, and she's reduced the pace to a tender-footed walk.
Oh, there's a cut. He's got a cut right up under his fetlock there, and every time he trots, it hurts him.
What brought this cut on?
Playing with the stallion over the fence.
So what are you going to do now? You're going to try and walk in, are you?
Yes, I'm going to try and walk in.
Okay.
So I'll be in the finalists.
And to think that Carolyn interrupted her honeymoon to take part in this ride. That's dedication. Only a horse lover would appreciate that. About 40 kilometres to go, the most challenging part of the ride, and 3 horses well in the clear. Phil Blackley and Jeff Marshall, 2 tough seasoned riders from Maitland in New South Wales, and 22-year-old Queenslander Carmen Batahan, the girl from the Condamine River. All three have won endurance rides in other parts of the country, but they've experienced nothing quite as hard as this before.
Where's the water, buddy? This away. Yep. They're in that creek there. Oh, beautiful. Good on you. Thanks, mate.
In the early stages of the race, the horses are discouraged from drinking, but now it's essential if they're not to become dehydrated. Water is marked at several spots along the route in water holes or billabongs like this. But even in such a pleasant setting, there's potential danger for horses and riders. It lies in the mud. If a horse goes too far in, it might not be able to get itself out again. Weakened by the effort of the ride, it could become stuck in the mud for hours until help could be found to pull it out, and that would cost the race. So if the horse is to drink and not find itself bogged, another role is to be found for that ever-useful and hard-wearing stockman's hat.
Camel, this bloke. Oh, mate, he's got to have it all. You don't know how far it's going to be till the next bloke. I don't care if I'm here for a quarter of an hour.
Mud on an animal's hoof can slow it down appreciably too. There's a lot to know about getting the best out of a horse. Even how hard to push it in the unusual heat of Western Queensland.
It's a different type of heat. For me, anyway. You can pick me, bro. They are. It is a different type of heat, and it's a bit hard to tell whether they're hot or cold because you can't see the sweat on them because there's no humidity up here like we have at home. And so you're riding him along, he looks dry, and you don't think he's sweaty, and he's very sweaty.
Well, sweat's very important, isn't it?
Well, it's his moisture. That's where he dehydrates. I've got to go. Cheerio. Come on, mate. Come on.
Jeff Marshall's companions are already on the road, not knowing that he's about to strike trouble and won't be catching them up. A wound has opened up around his horse's mouth and it's bleeding substantially. A tough setback for a rider who's been in the top three since before daybreak.
He feels all right now, but I'll go in. Those other two have gone. Yeah. I'll pick up with this chap here, you know.
What caused the bleed, do you think?
Well, I went to lead him into the water and the rain caught it.
Oh, yeah.
Just down here.
Is there anything you can do for it? You know, would a cloth help or anything?
No, I've got the stuff. It's a soccer tool.
Oh, yeah. But if it gets any worse, you'll have to drop out with it?
Well, if it starts to bleed, I will, yeah.
Disappointing.
Come a long way. Still, it's a tough game, isn't it? It's good fun, though. Couldn't hurt him, could you?
No.
He's done a pretty good effort.
Before that shotgun blast sent the riders out of Winton, the amateur form selectors were in full force. They believed there were a couple of favourites to be found among the veteran endurance riders in the field, but the shrewder tipsters felt a more likely winner would be found among entrants from distant areas. Leathery men, tough as their saddles. Generally, the experts were wrong, largely because they overlooked riders like this. Marion Vanderham. She's slight, stylish, young, and as her name implies, Dutch. With only a couple of hours to go for today, she's in a good position to surprise the leaders on the long, long road to Manaroo. Manaroo Station Homestead, centre of a 160,000-acre holding, typical of the giant spreads around here. Established, owned by a pastoral company, one of those properties selected by the early pioneers who pushed their cattle out here and decided this was their dream. Manaroo is the overnight stopping place for the ride. They've been in the saddle with barely a break for 16 hours for 200 kilometres. As usual, the veterinary teams are waiting first. 5 vets, 2 student vets, and 5 stock inspectors. Soon they're to give Phil Blackley one of the worst moments of his sporting life. Sticking with Blackley all the way was that girl from the Condamine River, Carmen Batterham. Despite her youth, Carmen's a veteran of endurance rides like this. She's beaten some of the toughest men riders in the country before, and she's ready to do it again. The blow falls on Phil Blackley. After 2 checks, the vets have decided that his horse is dehydrated. It's to be put out of the ride, eliminated. And there's only 50 kilometres to the finish. Carmen Batterham is now in the box seat. She'll have little to do tomorrow but keep up a steady pace over the comparatively short final stretch, and she's home in all senses of the word. But now, on the brink of exhaustion, she couldn't really care less. The The remainder of the survivors straggled in until 2 in the morning, 24 hours after that gunshot start in Winton.
Ready? 10, 9, 8, 7.
Manaroo Station, 8 a.m. and the start of the final leg into Longreach.
1, go!
What a sad bunch of riders it is. Of that confident field of 40 who clattered out of Winton, only 14 are left. The last 50 kilometres will be a breeze compared to the ordeal of the previous day, and there's almost a mood of exhilaration. The end's in sight. Just to finish is an achievement. They're pushing the pace now, but there's little doubt about the result. Carmen Batterham's lead is too substantial for her to be beaten unless her horse should break down. And she's not going to take that risk now as Longreach looms closer. Longreach in the Mitchell grasslands. It was founded to cater for the cattle drives that camped on the riverbanks here. And over the years, it became the link with the beef roads that roll into the far outback. Longreach is also the place where sheep country merges with cattle country, which is important. Not all the people who tamed the outback were cattlemen. Sheep breeders were prominent too. Because of its association with these pioneers and its central position, Longreach has been chosen as the site for the Stockman's Hall of Fame and Outback Heritage Centre. The land reserved for this $5 million project is the finish for the endurance ride. The finish at last, and only the best and the toughest have made it. For Carmen Batterham, it's a triumph well shared with her stock pony, Country.
And why are you always up round the top?
Well, I suppose he's the best horse. I don't know. I train him hard. The amount of work I give him, others fall over it. Others say, you're giving too much.
So you train him all the time?
Oh, not all the time. I give him breaks. Like, I virtually know the horse now. I can say when he's tired. I can say when he's due for a day off. I can say when he's not on his feed. I virtually know him, and he knows me. He knows what I expect from him.
Yeah.
I think that's why we make such a good team. I trust him, he trusts me.
Do you have any worries with him at all during the night?
No.
First night?
No.
Never at any time you reckon he was going to stop on you?
No. No.
No walking?
He's got a ton of guts.
Guts were a prerequisite for a ride like this, and so too the ability to take the worst and still come up smiling. Phil Blackley has the saddest story of all. Confident leader for 200 kilometres, only to be put out by a heartbeat that was a fraction fast.
I just don't know what it was, John. The last drink, do you think? Maybe the last... His, not yours. Yes, maybe the last drink. It was fairly devastating after being in front there for the whole 120 miles.
Yeah. Marion Vanderham, her coaxing style and the toughness of her pure Arab have combined to bring her home in second place. For her mentor, R.M. Williams, her performance brings the double satisfaction in that his team of 4 all came home and came home well.
See, when you arrived today, you're surrounded by ladies.
Oh, well, they're my team. That's the right way to do it, isn't it?
Of course it is.
Jack Macon, one-time cavalry officer, property owner, and grandfather 12 times over. An old war horse that will never hang up his saddle.
Last night, John?
About, I think it was 8 miles from the checkpoint under the chicken. And I thought, well, I've never chickened yet, so I went to sleep in the saddle for about 10 yards. I did 42 hours just still out of sleep.
You riding home, Ruffles?
In the car.
The winner's trophy a golden horseshoe. Well, it goes to show that we've still got people in this country capable of great feats of endurance, of tackling the bush and winning. But you know, a ride like this typifies pretty much the sort of ride that our ancestral pioneers used to do as a fairly regular sort of thing. And of course, in those days, it was a ride of necessity. That's the sort of thing they had to do to open up this huge country, maybe the toughest continent in the world.